Now, I'm sorry to say that the move toward the totalitarian state has actually taken a giant leap forward in the last 24 hours. You see, last night, French President Emmanuel Macron made some dramatic announcements that are clearly the first step in an authoritarian wave that is set to sweep Europe and then likely the world. I say that because there is no way a nation like France would make such moves, as were announced last night, without the approval of others in the European Union. And the Eurocrats, who actually run the whole show, they will make sure these reforms are adopted in other European countries, and then it is only a matter of time before it leeches out and reaches our shores, I should say. In a televised address, President Macron announced that COVID-19 vaccinations would now become compulsory for anyone that wants to work in or patronise a bar, a restaurant, or even a café. If you want to travel on a plane, a train, or a bus, you will need to be jabbed. Everyone over the age of 12 will need to have been vaccinated or display a recent negative test to access a public show, a concert, a festival, or even an amusement park. Now, similar moves have been announced or are actually afoot already in Italy, in Denmark, and in some German states, I understand. Now, this is the precursor of what we can expect. Despite the protestations to the contrary, any excuse will be used to introduce a vaccine passport. They might call it under some other name, but they will try and introduce it for citizens here. And I ask, why would a government want to do that? Surely it can't be simply a matter of public health. If it was, the current state governments would actually be doing their job better. You see, my own experience with the hopeless process of managing data in South Australia shows just how useless they actually are. I took a 2-day trip to Queensland. I was required then to isolate in South Australia for 14 days, even though Queenslanders were released after only 3. But after completing the arrival process at Adelaide Airport and heading into isolation, I then received a text message saying I wasn't actually allowed into my own state. But it was a bit late for that, I thought. Anyway, I kept in isolation, and when fronting up for my first COVID test, the nurse actually asked what instruction I'd received because people seemed to be getting different ones. And during my entire isolation, there was no check to see if I was actually adhering to it. And of course, it's because I'm so obedient to authority. We all know that. But it may have also been because they didn't actually have a record of my isolation, or it actually wasn't passed on to the people that are required to check on these things. Anyway, I did all the right things. 3 negative tests later, and after I finished my 2 weeks in ISO, I received another message from South Australian Health. And this one advising me I may need to head into isolation because I'd actually been in Queensland. Honestly, you cannot make this stuff up. And it's not hard to see why there's such a credibility gap in the response to COVID by the state governments. It really is a shambles. Well, at least it is in South Australia, and I suspect it isn't much different in anywhere else in the country. Now, we also know that the data associated with mandatory check-ins and QR code tracking has actually been misused, even though the authorities, promised it never would be. And does anyone out there really believe the promise that the data would actually be dumped after 28 days? I certainly don't. And that means, if I'm correct, they'll know every store, every shop and every premises you and I visited until they say we don't need to scan in. Now imagine if a COVID passport becomes mandatory. We'll always have to scan in. It won't stop the tracking because, of course, even if you're vaccinated, you can still catch and transmit COVID. I suspect it would actually expand the tracking. But what are the implications of being forced to take an experimental vaccine, especially given that we now do know that there are potentially serious side effects? Rare, but they are potentially serious. Well, in that space, we know governments have given the big pharma companies an exemption from liability for defects in their products. That means these companies are free to make tens of billions of dollars from COVID jabs without any possible repercussions. And it's almost impossible to sue the government or anyone who provides these jabs either. However, if your employer makes vaccination a mandatory condition of employment and you actually suffer an adverse reaction, it likely then becomes a workplace liability claim. Now, I suspect that's a potential liability that most employers haven't turned their mind to yet. So the simple question is, will the government be forced to exempt employers too? And then, if everything is perfectly safe, why are all these exemptions from liability actually necessary? Well, they're pretty simple questions, but so far, I'm still looking for a straight answer.